So let's in this video talk about the repository pattern, what it is, what the benefits are, the drawbacks are, what has the unit of work pattern to do with this, and how are we going to look at this in the code. So what is the repository pattern? The important idea here is to have one means of access for the data layer or the database layer, whatever you want to call it, and you want to encapsulate your CRUD operations in a single class. This gives us several benefits, which is of course the reason why we do this. And what it does is it supplies query method and command methods like you would think of when you think about the CRUD operations like create, read, update, and delete. The thing is, we would create one interface called the iRepository, which will be independent of the DataAccess technology itself. So you can use it anywhere in your code. And if you ever have to change the underlying database, it would be possible without any shift in the code. So this is the important idea, of course. You would normally go about this by creating one repository for each entity of your database. You would sometimes create different repositories, some for commands and some for queries. So you have the CQRS, which stands for Command Query Responsibility Separation. And you can sometimes implement your own business language, which might make sense in your domain to have different queries executed. So the benefits of the repository are pretty much the one means of data access. Why is this important and why is this a good idea? Because it forces all developers to use the same way to access the data. And this is important because it makes the code maintainable and makes it easier to reason about. And it's easier to extend and to maintain. So if you want to have something like caching on top of your repository, you can easily add this without changing anything in the code. Or if you would just use a database for testing purposes, a different one, you could simply change the repository for a test repository and would not need to change your code, which is pretty helpful, as you can imagine. It also allows us to easily implement afterwards things like caching, command query responsibility separation, and the aggregation and composition of entities in your database. When you, for example, have a complex structure which can be easier expressed in code, you can have a repository that gets different tables but merges or aggregates them into one entity in your code. So this is pretty easy with the repository pattern and is a really good benefit. You can also easily add a unit of work when you use the repository, implicitly or explicitly. We will talk later about what unit of work is, and we will see it also, the explicit one at least, in our code example. One extremely major thing in my opinion is that you can make your code very much easier for unit testing. Because if you have any database access technology, it doesn't matter for your unit testing code because you can simply either inject a repository that gives you exactly what you want to test, or have something that is an in-memory repository which replaces the actual repository you would use for your integration test. So you can separate the unit and integration test, which is pretty helpful. Of course, where benefits are, there's always some drawbacks. So if you implement a repository, you have to have at least some business knowledge. So you have to have some knowledge about your domain because you need a lot of thought to get this right. And you will have to put in the work to implement it in the correct ways. This might be a showstopper for you, maybe because it's really hard to do. But on the other hand, you have a centralized approach and a centralized access to your database. So if you change it anywhere, it is easier when you want to change something that you can change it in one place and have it applied everywhere. And of course, you saw we could easily add caching and things like that on top of the original repository, but this might make the whole thing very complex inside. And this then again has to be tested. So let's quickly talk about the unit of work pattern. So what is the unit of work pattern? It can be best described as an implicit transaction, which is either implicitly or explicitly called. So I don't like the implicit one because I tend to use explicit code before implicit code because I don't like when I don't see what happens and have to look into the thing itself to know what happens. I want to see it on the outside, and this is what the unit of work pattern gives us. So what would be an implicit or a transaction itself with the unit of work pattern? Don't confuse this with the direct database transaction because it's more like a logical transaction thing. So you would add, update, and then commit your changes, and the commit is part of the unit of work. And if anything in the meantime would go wrong or would throw an exception, you could stop the commit and nothing would happen. So nothing would be committed to the database, and you wouldn't even have a round trip. So this can be pretty helpful. And another thing is it requires a very clear coding path. So you have to think about your access to the database first when you want to change anything. So it makes your database much more maintainable, and it makes it much more easy to reason about your code. So of course, the unit of work only is for changing the database, not for read operations, only for the C, U, and D of the CRUD operation. So what are we going to look at in the code in the next video? We will build an example repository for our customer table with the Postgres database, which will be created as the iRepository of T interface, and the type parameter, of course, will be here the customers table. Usually you would create something like get by ID, get all, and get by specification. The specification then would be either as an object or as a link expression, which we will look at in the code example. Then, of course, you would have update, add, and delete for the CRUD operations, but we will only look at the get all and add method just to have it as easy as possible. So we will also create a unit of work which only has one method, which will be the commit method. Then we will create a Dapper and an entity framework repository, and we'll use them interchangeably. So in this manner, sort of, one of the repositories will add to the database a new customer. The other repository is used for reading. And now, because we used unit of work pattern, nothing will have happened. But if we then commit and read again, we will display all of the new added customers. So with that out of the way, we can tackle the code. So thanks for watching, and see you there.